My name is Katie, and this is Yappin' About History, a podcast where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. Welcome back. Today we'll be doing part 2 of our first two-parter. You don't necessarily need to listen to part 1 in order to understand what's going on in this week's episode, but the background information will definitely be a little bit more thorough in part 1, and it'll give you some more context for the topic we'll be discussing today, which is related to the historical horror novel that I read a few months ago called The Buffalo Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones. And like I said in the last episode, it's tied with The Reformatory by Tananarive Due as my co-favorite books of 2025. If you want to learn more about The Reformatory, I did an episode about it, so check that out. It's on the Dozier School for Boys. But anywho, The Buffalo Hunter is about a diary found in 2012, which is written by a Lutheran pastor in 1912, and it details a multi-day conversation he has with a mysterious Blackfeet native called Gus Doane. The conversations include talks about massacres, Blackfeet culture, and some supernatural happenings. I don't want to say anything else because I don't want to spoil it, but you have to read it. Okay, thanks. So the second topic we're going to talk about that's kind of related is the Marias or Bear Creek Massacre of 1870. I'd never heard of it before, and so I looked it up because I wanted to know if it was real or just part of the fictional part of the story, and unfortunately it is real, and it's one of the worst massacres of indigenous people by the US government, but it's also one of the least known, although that's not super surprising since we don't really learn much about any of the massacres of indigenous people. So we're going to correct that today. But before we get into it, I just wanted to mention that if you want to learn a little bit more about what life is like now for the Montana Blackfeet peoples, there's a documentary on YouTube called Life in the Land Blackfeet Nation, and I'll link that in the episode description. So let's start off with a quick recap of where we are in 1870. And like I said, if you want a more detailed background, you can check out part 1, which is the episode before this one. Native tribes have been forcibly removed from the South and relocated into what is now Oklahoma, thousands of dying along the way. In the mid-1800s. Throughout this century, indigenous peoples are forced onto smaller and smaller reservations and have had their sovereignty taken away, making them wards of the US government, which means that they are not legally allowed to leave the reservation unless they have special permission. And as we learned in the previous episode, the buffalo had been increasingly hunted for their hides in order to totally devastate the way of life and to kill off the Great Plains tribes. These tribes relied heavily on buffalo, not only for their meat, but they used every part of the animal for different tools, housing materials, clothing, etc. The buffalo once had a population of 30 to 40 million, but by the 1880s, it was estimated to have dwindled down to just around 500. Although we'll be focusing on just one massacre in detail, the history of the U.S. is a history of massacres of indigenous peoples. And in larger conflicts like the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War, the U.S. was also fighting separate Indian wars at the same time. I feel like here's a good place to read you one of my favorite quotes from The Buffalo Hunter, and it goes, "I thought the flag was a blanket for all you Americans to hide under. It flew above the bear the day they killed Heavy Runner," Goodstab said back without pause. "It flies above every camp of dead Indians. I will always pull them down. You put your reminders of pain on the wall and pray to them. We still hurt, so we don't need that reminder." And then just in the 1800s, leading up to 1870, we have the Battle of Tippecanoe, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, 3 different Seminole Wars, the Arikara War, Black Hawk War, Comanche War. Specifically for the Great Plains area, there was the Sand Creek Massacre on November 29th, 1864, where during the Civil War, around 675 volunteer U.S. soldiers laid siege against the Cheyenne and the Arapaho village of around 750 people around Sandy Creek. This was a long-standing fight for control of Colorado's eastern Great Plains, and as the natives tried to escape, soldiers killed them all, totaling 230, and most of them were women, children, and elderly. And then the next day, the soldiers came back to scalp and desecrate the bodies. Then we have Red Cloud's War from 1866 to 67, which started after the discovery of gold in Montana. John Bozeman, a Western pioneer, created the Bozeman Trail, which ran through indigenous territory and what was then the Wyoming Territory. Understandably, this angered Red Cloud, the leader of the Oglala, who also had U.S. forces on their land and had failed treaty meetings with the U.S. leading up to this. So then he teamed up with the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, which included Crazy Horse and High Backbone, to ambush travelers and U.S. military along the trail. Eventually, this leads to the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868, which is considered the only American Indian War win against the United States, and it granted the Sioux the right to settle in the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. But if you know your history, this right was supposedly ceded when gold was found in the area and after the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, which is also referred to as Custer's Last Stand. Even though the U.S. lost that battle, the U.S. still forced Native peoples onto reservations and took back control of the Black Hills through what the Sioux called a, quote, Sell or Starve Act, which added on to the Indian Appropriations Act of 1876. And it basically cut off all food and supplies for the Sioux until they stopped fighting and gave the Black Hills back to the U.S., which all went against the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And if you remember from the last episode, by this time, most of the buffalo had already been killed off, forcing the Plains tribes to rely on U.S. rations and supplies. So hence the sell or starve aspect of this. This act is also still really disputed even today. If you remember back in our Ghosts episode, we talked about how the Sioux actually won a Supreme Court case against the U.S. government in which the ruling said that the government had violated the treaty but had awarded them money instead of the land, and the Sioux had refused to accept the money. And also that's where Mount Rushmore was built, for context. But now let's talk a little bit more about the Montana area, because this is where the Marias Massacre takes place. The fur trade and the discovery of gold in the late 1850s led to a rapid colonization of this area. In northern Montana, white settlers would trespass into the homelands of the southern Blackfeet in the following decade, hoping to quickly end the indigenous' land titles, which led to a military buildup. The territorial governor, Sidney Egerton, asked the legislature to, quote, take steps for the extinguishment of the Indian title in this territory in order that our lands may be brought into the market, end quote. In 1870, the Department of the Interior controlled the Office of Indian Affairs. General Sherman was not a fan of this and wanted it returned to the War Department so that the Army would have complete control over Indian affairs on and off the reservations and the ability to respond to settler Indian conflicts without oversight. Even though there was the peace policy of 1869 in place, the practice of total submission supported by Sherman and Sheridan, who was the commander of the military division of the Missouri Territory, remember, these were the key players in our last episode, dictated much of the country's actual interactions with the natives. Whenever indigenous people were outside of their reservation, they were, quote, under the original and exclusive jurisdiction of military authority, is what Sheridan claimed. Tribes who complied were considered friendly, while those who resisted confinement or persisted in their traditional ways were, quote, hostile. Thus, they became justifiable targets. Both Sherman and Sheridan sought to end the government's policy of making treaties, preferring the use of military to force unconditional surrender. And in the summer of 1869, Sheridan ordered that, quote, all Indians who do not immediately remove to their reservations will be treated as hostile wherever they may be found, end quote. And Roger C. Henderson, who is an associate professor of history at Penn State, wrote in the Magazine of Western History, expansionism and imperialism have often been justified by the ideology of manifest destiny in order to obscure the ruthlessness of the United States' dispossession of indigenous inhabitants. Histories in the West often reveal cultural and ideological values that undermine and in many cases deny the validity of Native peoples' experiences as they too experienced Western expansion, end quote. And that's the attitude that leads us up to the Marias Massacre. Trader, as in of goods, Alexander Culbertson observed that 1870 would forever be engraved as, quote, the year of the smallpox and soldiers, end quote. So I got most of the information from Roger C. Henderson's article, which will be in the episode description along with all the other sources that I used. The rapid military expansion created unease amongst the tribes, especially the ones that were deemed hostile. This area of Montana was heavily garrisoned, meaning that there were a lot of forts with military troops there in order to prevent tribes from defending themselves or trying to attack. More skirmishes and hostilities disrupted trade and travel. The superintendent of Indian Affairs in Montana, Alfred Sully, requested Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Eli Parker, to arrange for additional troops to protect citizens, inhibit whiskey traders, and prevent white people from indiscriminately killing Indians. Sully believed that white ruffians were largely responsible for the conflicts, but Parker alleged that the Indians regarded the United States' non-fulfillment of treaty stipulations as, quote, just cause for a general war involving all the tribes in the Blackfoot Confederacy. And I mean, if you break your treaty, I mean, hello. Anywho. Editing Katie here. I just wanted to say that the pronunciations of some of the indigenous tribes may not be 100% correct. One that I did notice while I was editing specifically is Pagan. That is a little bit closer to how it should be pronounced. The other is Picani. Just as a little reminder, when you hear me and I'm not pronouncing it maybe 100%, this serves as the correction for that. And then a man named Malcolm Clark was murdered on August 17th, 1869, and his son Horace was seriously injured by a young pagan man named Peter Owlchild and his friends. Sully pretty much dismissed this as just a sad circumstance, and even the commander at Fort Shaw and military district of Montana, Philippe Brigitte de Trobriand, thought of this event as kind of like the culmination of a long-standing family feud. You see, Clark was married to Owlchild's cousin. Then, in October, a grand jury convened to investigate Clark's murder and allegations that Indians had committed livestock depredations attacks. U.S. Marshal William F. Wheeler presented a list of 56 white settlers that had been allegedly killed by Indians. He also claimed that the Indians had stolen over 1,000 horses in just that year alone. He also sought indictments for 5 Picani, allegedly ID'd by Horace Clark and Helen Clark, who was Malcolm's daughter, as their dad's killers. Trobriand, acting on behalf of the military, testified that the Helena Citizens Committee was asked to supply info regarding the Indian hostilities, but they hadn't sent in any evidence. Therefore, he said, we have to assume that there are no hostilities, and he even said that, quote, there's actually no Indian war in the territory, end quote. But as you can guess, it didn't really matter, because the litigants presented themselves as engaged in a great, quote, contest between civilization and barbarism, end quote, and presented misleading evidence claiming settlers suffered from great losses by, quote, predatory bands of Indians. They wanted assurances that military action would be taken against the Blackfeet tribes. They alleged that these Indians had, quote, moved their women and children, end quote, over the border into British territory in order to obtain, quote, supplies of ammunition and improved arms, end quote. The grand jury conclusion was this. This is a declaration of war on the whites of Montana. Warrants for the arrest of the 5 pagan accused of killing Malcolm Clark resulted from the grand jury's indictments, which was just the thing that General Sheridan needed to call up more troops to the area and launch an offensive winter attack on the pagans. He had already used this tactic on the Kiowa in 1867 and the Cheyennes and the Comanches in 1868. He knew that attacking in the morning during winter would make it almost impossible for the indigenous to move their stock and villages, and this would therefore make it very hard to escape and increase the odds for their campaign's success. Sheridan proposed to Sherman, quote, let me find out exactly where these Indians are going to spend the winter, and about the time of good heavy snow, I will send out a party and try to strike them when they will be very helpless, end quote. He knew that, quote, only women and children and the decrepit old men were with the villages, end quote, and that, quote, we must occasionally strike where it hurts, end quote. And he stated the purpose of the winter attack was to, quote, strike the Indians a hard blow and force them onto reservations, to show to the Indian that he, with his villages and stock, could be destroyed, end quote. General Sherman sent word on November 4th, 1869, that he, quote, proposed action for the punishment of these marauders has been approved. Sheridan then took this approval and expanded upon it to include attacking camps with any Picani and he recommended Major Eugene Baker of the U.S. 2nd Cavalry to lead this expedition. In early January 1870, Trobriand ordered Baker to, quote, chastise that portion of the Indian tribe of Piegan under Mountain Chief or his sons, end quote, but that he should leave Heavy Runners and Big Lakes camps alone because they were deemed friendly. So they all head north to the Marias River with 217 soldiers and officers, 55 mounted infantrymen, and 83 infantry soldiers. They are guided by Joe Kipp, who's only 20 years old at the time, and he is a son of trader James Kipp, who had built the first trading post for the Piegan in 1831, and his mom was Earthwoman, the daughter of a Mandan chief. Kipp had also served as an interpreter and was to provide Baker with, quote, all necessary information about the different Blackfeet camps. Baker had only been in Montana for a month at this point and had little knowledge of the different Piegan bands. Yet on multiple occasions, he dismissed Kipp's efforts to identify any of the camps. So on the morning of January 23rd, 1870, in northern Montana, with the temperatures around negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, U.S. Army troops under Major Eugene Baker attacked the sleeping camp of Pecunny Chief Heavy Runner along the Bear Creek, which is now the Marias River. Heavy Runner went up to Baker to show him papers that he had that were proof of him being, quote, friend to the whites, but they shot him. Point blank. Most of the people in the camp were sick with smallpox, and not only that, but it was mostly women, children, and elderly because all the able-bodied men were out on a hunt. They ended up killing around 200 people and destroyed all of the teepees and lodges and other possessions, and then took the horses, which would make it almost impossible for any survivors to make it through the harsh winter. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, settlers applauded the Piegan expedition. One member boasted, quote, wherever we passed on our return, we were greeted with cheers and invited to partake freely of the hospitality of the people, end quote. 4 months after the attack, a newly arrived immigrant observed that, quote, the Indians have been remarkably quiet. Baker's raids on the Piegan seem to have shed terror amongst them, end quote. The initial reports that came back from Baker and other U.S. officials celebrated this victory against a hostile group of Indians, but over time, firsthand accounts from survivors and other non-Indian observers began to expose the truth of what actually took place. One of those accounts was taken by the Blackfoot Indian agent, Lieutenant Pease, who went to talk to the Pecunny after like a week or so after the massacre. He reported that only 15 of the dead were men of fighting age. The rest were elderly, women, or children. This account was endorsed by the Superintendent of Montana Indian Affairs, General Alfred Sully. General Sherman decided to release a statement even before getting Baker's second account and ignoring Lieutenant Pease and General Sully, and he said, quote, I prefer to believe that the majority of those killed in Mountain Chief's camp were warriors, and that the firing ceased the moment resistance was at an end, that quarter was given to all who asked for it, and that 100 women and children were allowed to go free to join the other bands of the same tribe camped nearby, rather than the absurd report that there were only 13 warriors killed, and that all the balance were women and children more or less afflicted with smallpox, end quote. However, both Baker's and Pease's reports go out into the public, and people start noticing the huge discrepancies, and some of it was published in the New York Times, and then it was also read into Congress, and news of it actually being an atrocity began to spread. So this all becomes a very embarrassing turn of events for General Sherman, so he demands that Baker deliver an accurate account of the deceased and the analysis of what happened. Baker pretty much stands his ground with his initial claims and said Sully and Pease weren't there so that they wouldn't know and shouldn't be listened to. And it looked like the girls are fighting, if you know what I mean. The Army sort of kind of looks into the events again after the public outcry, and they have Inspector General of the Military Division of the Missouri, James Hardy, investigate. Hardy talks to Trobriand, but never talks to Horace Clark or Joe Kipp, who would have corroborated Pease's report that it was a massacre massacre of elderly women and children. Sheridan chimes in with his own report, which is coincidentally a word-for-word repeat of most of his 1868 report of the Washita Massacre, saying the Indian women and children fought as fiercely and desperately as the men, so that non-combatant designation hardly applied. He also claimed that the women and children were killed accidentally. So, I mean, are the women and children warriors or are they accidentally killed? Even though Baker's reports don't match up with what Pease's reports say, Baker's two reports become the official military record of the massacre. Conveniently, the Army and Navy Journal come to Sherman's assistance, publishing 3 articles by soldier participants in March of 1870 that helped transform the massacre into a proper fight. And then there's actually a website by a couple of authors who are writing a book on the subject that has collected all of the firsthand accounts that they could find from people involved in the massacre. And it's really interesting. If you want to read all of them, the link will be in the episode description. I just kind of thought it was funny. The website, I think, is supposed to be dickshovel.com, but I kept reading it as Dick Shovel. So be careful when you look up the link, and I would suggest clicking on it from the episode description. But anywho, I wanted to highlight a couple of those people's accounts because what better source is there than from the people who were actually there? So the first person we're going to talk about is Lieutenant Gus Doane of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. As the troops were nearing their home base in the beginning of February, a settler asked the lieutenant whether the Indians would now remain quiet, and he said, "Well, I can't say, but there are certainly 173 very good arguments in favor of their remaining quiet, lying out on the Marias." And then 19 years later, Doane, well aware of more famous massacres in that area, assessed the strike against the Piegan as, quote, "the greatest slaughter of Indians ever made by U.S. troops," end quote. Doane was very proud of what they had done and would brag about the massacre on multiple occasions. And then in 1891, he wrote, "I remember the day when we slaughtered the Piegan, how it occurred to me as I sat on the bank of the Marias and watched the stream of their blood, which ran down on the frozen river over half a mile, that the work we were doing would be rewarded, as it has been." Interestingly, Horace Clarke was actually a part of this expedition along with his brother Nathan. Remember, it was their dad Malcolm's murder that kind of sort of kicked off this expedition just a few months earlier. And also remember that they were half Piegan and that Horace was only 15 years old at the time, and he had suffered a major head wound during his dad's attack and murder. A bullet actually entered through his right nostril and exited out of his left ear. So here is some excerpts from his sworn deposition to the Indian Claims Commission. Quote, "I was in the Baker fight and personally knew Heavy Runner, a good Indian and a friend of the white people. His camp was practically wiped out. Those who were not killed were left homeless and penniless. 1,300 head of horses and several thousand buffalo robes were taken from the people. It is an undeniable fact that Colonel Baker was drunk and did not know what he was doing." And then from his interview with Plassman, he said, "The young men were on a hunt. Heavy Runner came forward to meet us, holding up his medals and his papers, and then he was shot. I was present at this fight. I wanted my father's murderers. I did what I could to save life, but one could do little with soldiers after they had tasted blood. Heavy Runner was a wealthy and good man, and he was also a friend of the whites. The hostile camp was Mountain Chiefs, and that was the camp we meant to strike. But owing to too much excitement and confusion and misinformation, the Heavy Runner camp were the sufferers and the victims of the circumstances." And then here's a summary from Plassman after she had interviewed Horace. She wrote, "The soldiers' officers were in no condition to issue orders. The cold might have something to do with it, but the whole affair is a hideous blot on our army record. The thermometer ranged nearly 40 below, almost unendurable, but one of the company told me that officers and men tried to keep their spirits up by taking spirits down, and at the end of the journey they had scarcely knew what they were doing. Horace told me that Joe Kipp tried his best to convince Baker of Kipp's mistake, but that officer and gentleman had been too long in conference with John Barleycorn to heed the warning. On good authority, both officers and men are reported to have been considered the worst for liquor. They had marched a weary distance to kill Indians, and now they had meant to do it. So they charged into the village, shooting left and right and cutting down any within reach. slaughtering by wholesale men, women, and little children. A thorough job of it. It was a preventable tragedy directly due to a scout's error and the condition of Major Baker. Officers and men had a wee drab too much and unfitted themselves to act intelligently. End quote. And just kind of to sum up what happened to Baker after this massacre, I mean, before that, he had several sick leaves during the Civil War, which was mostly due to his alcoholism. So it's pretty believable that he could have or would have been drunk during the Marias Massacre. And then 2 years after that, he was too drunk to command, and his troops were almost wiped out at Pryor's Creek, Montana, when attacked by several hundred Sioux. He was then court-martialed in 1873 for arresting one of his own officers while Baker, was drunk. He was sentenced to dishonorable discharge, but General Sherman changed the sentence to 6 months at half pay. And then he died in 1884 at age 47. There is no mention of the Marias Massacre in Baker's official record. Then we have Corporal Dan Starr, as recorded by historical writer Thomas B. Marquis. And he says Baker had made known the paramount feature of his military policy when he announced a motto, "Nits make lice." This was the customary way of indicating that children were not to be spared. With the general extermination idea impressed upon the troops, the camp was quickly surrounded. 8 warriors were taken prisoner. While accompanying the soldiers, they made attempts to escape, as was natural. One night, the recapture of 2 of them who had tried to slip away, the officer of the guard lost his temper. He issued an order, "Kill them, every damned one of them." The soldier guards began to get their guns ready. "No, don't use your guns," the officer intervened. "Get axes and kill them one at a time." The 8 prisoners were being kept in various tents and were inveigled out one at a time and disposed of in accordance to the order given. The next morning, the captives were reported as having been killed while trying to escape. The report was not questioned. The true case was well understood, but nobody talked openly about it. End quote. And then the historian Marquis adds, Dan Starr told me the particulars of this bloody incident. He was one of the guard that night, so he was one of the axe murderers. He never indicated to me that he felt any pricklings of conscience on account of his action in the affair. In fact, all through that region in those times, the killing of an Indian under any circumstances and in any manner was regarded as an act so commendable as to approach the status of a stern duty. And then we have Joe Kipps recounting, and remember he was the half Indian scout interpreter. When author Frank B. Linderman much later asked Joe Kipp to describe the attack for a written narrative, Kipp refused, saying, "Nope, Frank, by God, if I'd tell the truth, they'd hang me yet. Sure as hell, you know." Interestingly, Kipp would go on to marry one of Heavy Runner's daughters, Martha, and adopt her children, who had been left fatherless due to the attack. We also have firsthand accounts from some of the survivors in the form of sworn affidavits presented to the Indian Claims Commission between 1913 and 1915. Here's Mrs. Frank Monroe's story. "My father's family was among the first to pitch camp on the Marias River. We came down on the north side of the river to Heavy Runner's camp. Before we had pitched camp, most of the party went out after buffalo, and after the camp was pitched, another part started out on the hunt. The next morning, a party of soldiers came. When they came in sight, someone called out in the camp for Chief Heavy Runner to take his papers and medal and go out to meet the soldiers. When Heavy Runner went out to meet the soldiers, there was great excitement in the camp. Then there was much firing by the soldiers, and I heard someone call out that Heavy Runner had been shot and killed as he was crossing the river to meet the soldiers. Then the soldiers began firing into the camp. After the firing was over, the soldiers went through the camp and picked out what robes and blankets they wanted for themselves, and the rest was all got together and burned. Also, all of the lodges and some of the wounded people were burned up. My mother was wounded in the hand by a bullet. She, with others, including myself, sneaked away after the firing was over and made our way to a camp further up the river. As we were going, we saw the soldiers rounding up the horses belonging in the camp." Okay, guys, I think I found good stab. This is the account of a woman named Buffalo Trail Woman who was 22 at the time. She says, "I was present at the Baker Massacre. The firing lasted for quite a spell. Some of those in the lodge were where I was killed. Some of those in the lodge where I was were killed. My husband Good Stab, also known as Yellow Owl, realized that what was taking place and prepared for war. He went to his mother's lodge, some distance away, and was shot and killed there. I myself was wounded on the back and on my left ear. The scars are to this day plainly shown. I saw how others in our lodge were shot, including an old man who dug a trench near the fire pit, a kind of fort. Our lodge was pitched a considerable distance from the others. Later, the soldiers marched to our lodge and fired upon it. The old man got into his trench and covered himself with buffalo skin trimmings. Later, I saw the soldiers gather all of the belongings of the camp and set them on fire. But before this was done, the scout or interpreter for the soldiers came to where I and other wounded were. He told us to get our things and that they would move us to 2 lodges that were spared from fire or capture for hospital purposes because the rest of the camp furnishings were going to be burned. The soldiers surrounded the lodge where I had been and fired upon it, killing everyone except those who escaped by chance. But the soldiers did care for some wounded ones by sheltering them in the 2 lodges and giving them some food. But these were mostly women and children. I also noticed that the soldiers gathered all the horses and drove them away. After the soldiers had left, an Indian woman who was married with the Blackfeet came to where I was looking for my daughter, whom I thought had escaped. I answered the woman, and she came into the lodge where I was. Then she and I made a tour, searching for my little girl and her husband. She found him mortally wounded in his mother's lodge. As she was peeping into the lodge, talking to her husband, he asked her for a drink of water, but a soldier came along and pushed her to one side. He saw that her husband was still alive, opened fire upon him, and shot him dead. Later, the interpreter told me to escape and said that I had no business being out among the men. I did escape, and after I had gone to safety, I observed a great deal of smoke going up, which proved to be the burning of the exterminated camp. The soldiers left the camp, taking all of the horses away with them. What I have said is, to the best of my recollection, what happened. And then you can read more of the accounts on that website, but I thought it would be good to hear from some of the soldiers and survivors. In June of that year, Mountain Chief denied that he had done anything to indicate that his tribal nation had declared war on the United States, and he said that he, quote, hoped that the future had something better in store for him and his now bowed down people. End quote. And he said that the military attack had spread terror amongst them. So then moving on to the story, in January 1st of 1880, Marshall Wheeler declared in the Helena Weekly Herald that, quote, it has been safe to travel all over their country, quote, end quote, and took pride in announcing the white conquest of the Pecans was nearly complete. Baker's expedition may have been a continuation of efforts targeting Mountain Chief, but its deeper purpose was to subjugate the Piegan. The attack destroyed their resistance and facilitated their dispossession. On April 25th, 1870, Montana Congressman James H. Kavanaugh introduced a bill to extinguish Indian land title and to open up additional areas to white settlement. And in 1872 and 73, President Grant issued 2 executive orders altering the size of the Blackfeet reservation and transferring portions to the public domain. And then in 1885, Michael Leeson's A History of Montana from 1739 to 1885 summarized the prevailing attitude. In a quote, in this manner, the war against the Piegans was closed, and the first great lesson in good manners taught the savage of this territory, end quote. Then, a couple years later, in 1887, an act of Congress reduced the remaining reserved Piikani lands by an additional 17 million acres. In 1913, 2 of Heavy Runner's surviving children, Spearwoman and Last Gun, asked for reimbursement from the federal government for the losses that they had suffered. They said that, we believe that we have a valid and just claim against the government because of the killing of our father, Chief Heavy Runner, without just cause or provocation, and for the destruction and taking of our property. They asked for $75,000, which is around $2.5 million today, because of a, quote, great wrong committed by federal troops against us and our people, end quote. Other survivors signed affidavits to support the siblings, and that's where we get those firsthand accounts. And then in 1915, Oregon Senator Harry Lane introduced a bill to reimburse the heirs of Chief Heavy Runner on account of his death and for the property taken from him at the time of the Baker Massacre. He introduces this bill 3 more times in the next 2 years, and then another senator from Montana, Thomas James Walsh, proposes similar bills in 1920 and 1921, but none of them pass. It seemed that because they were Indians, their words carried less validity and their personal memories were not as reliable as published military reports. Basically, their claim was rejected because their memories of the massacre could not be reconciled with written records created and amended in 1870, because that would mean admitting that the U.S. Army had committed a massacre of indigenous people, which would probably open them up to more lawsuits and scrutiny and reveal the plans and strategies they had for getting rid of, quote, the Indian problem. And remember, relations between the U.S. government and indigenous peoples in the 1920s was not doing any better than it had really in the 1870s. So the US government had no incentive to admit to any wrongdoing, because then it would have to admit that they were still doing things wrong. And in 1935, one of the survivors, Bearhead, at age 79, wanted his story of the events written down for the whites to read so that they could, quote, learn what their fathers did to us, end quote. And his friend, author James Willard Schultz, wrote down his story. And then John Henderson, the historian and professor, wrote, quote, in telling their story, Heavy Runner's heirs and other survivors engaged in the politics of memory and set in motion counter memories as they brought to light the Bikini narrative and transformed the standard story into an inclusive one. These narratives are essential for understanding the historical trauma that massacres generated. Just like the Cheyennes who survived Sand Creek or the Washita, the Apaches at Camp Grant, and the Lakotas at Wounded Knee, the Bikunis were haunted by painful memories for the remainder of their lives, and entire tribes lived in fear of a repeat offensive against their people, end quote. The violence inflicted on their ancestors in 1870 remains in the Bikini social and cultural consciousness. Many families on the reservation are direct descendants of the survivors from Heavy Runner's band. Frequently, Blackfeet tribal members gather at the massacre site on the Bear or Marias River on January 23rd, and if you've read Buffalo Hunter, you know. They sing, pray, and participate in commemoration ceremonies on behalf of the victims and survivors of the massacre. Part of the process of coping with the historical trauma is telling the stories of what happened and reframing the event from the perspective of the people who were killed. Tribes have names for such events and the sites where they took place. In Montana, Piikani descendants of Heavy Runner's band know the site on Big Bend on the Marias River where their families and friends perished as killed off the Piegans. To wrap things up, I wanted to touch on a topic that is tangentially related to the story, and this is the renaming of Mount Doane, one of the highest peaks in Yellowstone National Park. As we discussed, Lieutenant Doane was one of the people involved in the Marias Massacre and was really proud and liked to brag about it. But he was also a Civil War vet and played a key role in the exploration and establishment of Yellowstone Park. So that's how he got his name on the mountain, which, by the way, was named after him only a year after the massacre. But momentum to change the name finally caught on, and in 2014, when the Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council submitted a proposal to rename both Mount Doane and Hayden Valley. The valley was named after geologist Ferdinand Hayden, who had negative views towards tribal people, and those views included, quote, if indigenous people did not comply with federal demands to settle and adopt agricultural or pastoral lifestyles, they must ultimately be exterminated. And then he further argued that, quote, if extermination is the result of non-compliance, then compulsion is an act of mercy, end quote. There's a lot of boring meeting stuff that happens between the different boards and groups. There's the Park County, Wyoming Board of Geographic Names, and the National Parks Service. They all give their views and reports to the U.S. Board of Geographic Names, who makes the final decision. Some of the arguments against changing Hayden Valley was because, quote, opinions are not as horrible as actions. For sure. And the arguments against changing Mount Doane were that changing maps is really hard. But it's not really hard to change it if you want to rename the Gulf of Mexico, though, huh? Anyways, and that Doane had just been, quote, following orders, which is wild. He was actively participating in genocide, but not really because he wanted to. It was simply because he was being a good little soldier and following orders. Sounds familiar, right? Just as a little side note for current events, we're so quick to turn to Nazi Germany to make comparisons to what's happening today and like following orders with ICE and stuff. But when in reality, we don't even have to leave our own borders to find plenty of comparisons. See today's episode. Anyway, The name change for Hayden Valley does not get approved, but the name change for Mount Doane does. And it is, as of 2022, it is now referred to as First Peoples Mountain. And I gotta say, the name change got in right at the buzzer because there's no way that would have been approved today. And honestly, while I was reading about this, I got this gut feeling that it had already been changed back to Mount Doane because Mount Denali has already been reverted back to Mount McKinley, and there's multiple national park sites that have removed educational signs and plaques about indigenous people, Black people, and climate change. This is all under Trump's executive order called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. But as of this recording on February 5th, 2026, it is still being referred to as the First Peoples Mountain, as far as I can tell. However, it's not looking good because literally just a couple weeks ago, the Grand Teton National Park removed a sign in the Craig Thomas Discovery and Visitor Center that was part of the info plaque under Doane's sculpture, which informed visitors of his role in the Marias Massacre. The park has declined to comment, but the Interior Department is claiming that it's all just part of routine sign maintenance and interpretive updates. For sure, Elizabeth Peace, their spokesperson. Tom Rogers, who is an enrolled member of the Blackfeet Nation and a political consultant representing the interests of indigenous peoples, said, "No matter what side of the aisle you reside on or what God you pray to, I think we can all agree upon the fact that an individual who is responsible for leading a massacre of innocent Blackfeet women and children should be remembered as such." And I agree, Tom. He also doesn't agree with how the original signage talked about Doane in the first place as a, quote, challenging figure. He says that he wasn't just a challenging person, he was a war criminal. And there's a difference. And I was like, yeah, that's right. You tell him, Rogers. And then we have Bill Snell, an executive director of that Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council we talked about that kind of started off this name change process. And he said, "It's unfortunate that we're trying to hide history. Doing that can hinder people from understanding the plight of American Indians and the impact it has had on us in regards to our trauma and our resiliency as tribes to recover." And that's one of the things that like pisses me off about erasing our history. And when you erase the bad, besides the obvious erasing of the horrific violent parts and the trauma, you're also erasing those people's stories of bravery, resilience, and survival. But I guess that's the point when your aim is for a white supremacist patriotic history. But I don't want to end this part on a depressing note because there is something that you can do. There is a concerted effort to document all the signs at National Historic Sites and parks and tracking the removals with a group called Save Our Signs. I'll link their website in the episode description, but you can upload pictures that you take at national parks of their signs in order to help preserve history. So if you find yourself on vacation or you live near a national park or historical site, please consider taking pictures of the signs and uploading them to the website. It's a direct way that you can help. And just like Good Stab said, I am the Indian who can't die. I am the worst dream America ever had. As hard as the US government tried to kill off the indigenous people or the buffalo, they weren't successful. And they won't be successful with erasing our history either. And to wrap up this whole thing, I wanted to end where the past two episodes started for me, and that is with some words from Stephen Graham Jones about the horror genre and why it's important to him. He wrote, "Horror, no matter the subgenre, is always about survival of the body, the mind, the heart, the soul, the status quo, the future. While horror isn't the sole province of American Indians, horror's for everyone. It does track that the many sovereign nations here in North America that survived an attempted genocide, a violent displacement, and a continuing erasure might find resonances in this genre that best dramatizes the survival we've been actively engaged in since about 1492. Another thing horror can provide is hope. Watching others struggle against insurmountable forces and make it through to the other side is fun and cathartic. But the premise allowing that dynamic to process through to its conclusion is that there is another side up there somewhere at the end of all of this. American Indians were in the exact same struggle against seemingly insurmountable forces. We're still waiting for this occupation to end. We're still waiting for this all to be a bad, bloody dream. We're waiting for that light at the end of this centuries-long tunnel. We need that hope. Until that day, though, we wait and we scowl and we laugh a lot more than you think." So when you see us all reading this bloody book, watching that scary film, playing that horror game compulsively, remember that what we're doing here, it's surviving. The media you and yours choose to consume, it's nearly always either what best embodies your fears and struggles or the direct opposite of that. So you can pretend those fears and struggles don't exist. Over the generations, over the centuries of occupation and displacement, reduction and commodification, we've learned that you can't ignore a bad thing away, though. We choose instead to face it, to know it, to watch it, to wait it out. Ideally with a vampire or werewolf story in our lap, or with jump scares flickering on screen, or with our fingers on the buttons of our own virtual Gatling guns to mow zombies down in this continuing post-apocalypse. Horror's not native, no, but it's native to us. And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something new and are reminded that what we do today will shape the stories that are told tomorrow. History isn't something we remember, it's something we carry with us. And I'll see you next week. Bye.